Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack a highly structured theological framework introduced in a text known as the Berean spine. We'll be looking at exactly how this framework attempts to interpret some really broad and often fiercely debated biblical terms concerning sexuality, life, and gender. Now, obviously, these are highly charged topics in our culture right now. They generate endless conversation, debate, and controversy. But whether you personally agree with the conclusions presented in this text or not, understanding how this specific framework operates is absolutely crucial for navigating today's cultural conversations. It offers a very distinct, almost architectural way of reading ancient texts. So let's jump right in.
The central question the author tackles here is one we see debated all the time across modern media, academia, and theology. Basically, how exactly should modern readers interpret ancient words like abomination or sexual immorality? Language naturally changes over time, right? So it's super easy to assume that ancient words might just be culturally fluid, kind of like blank slates. The debate really centers on whether these broad biblical words are empty vessels waiting to be filled with whatever our modern evolving culture deems appropriate, or if they are strictly and permanently defined by earlier scriptural boundaries. Well, the source material we're exploring today argues firmly for the latter. It insists on a strict historical and textual continuity.
To explore the author's answer, we're going to trace this framework chronologically through 6 sections. We'll cover the Berean approach, Genesis and created nature, the architecture of boundaries, gathered categories of immorality, Revelation and empire, and finally wrap up with the gospel of restoration.
Okay, Section 1, the Berean approach, where Scripture defines Scripture.
The anchor of the author's entire argument rests on this single, powerful premise. Generalized does not mean undefined. The author argues forcefully that broad biblical words are absolutely not empty containers. When later texts use general terms to describe morality or sin, they aren't just erasing history. Rather, the framework asserts that those generalized terms are strictly and entirely defined by what God has already spoken in earlier foundational texts. Think of a generalized word as essentially a shorthand code, one that locks in a wealth of prior, highly specific definitions.
The methodology used here is called the Berean approach. If you look historically at the book of Acts, the Bereans were a group of people totally famous for eagerly cross-examining the claims they heard against the actual ancient scriptures. They didn't just take things at face value. Following that legacy, this approach outlines 3 very specific steps. Step 1 is to actively test modern claims against the actual text, rather than just relying on popular slogans or contemporary emotional pressure. Step 2 requires the reader to recognize that broad terms act as gathered categories, meaning they essentially scoop up previous, highly specific laws into a single word. And step 3, which is really the most vital, allowing older scripture to govern and define newer scripture. The foundational rule here is quite simply that scripture defines scripture.
Moving on to Section 2, Genesis and created nature, the foundation of the whole thing.
According to this framework, the very first move to understand New Testament morality isn't to look at the real books of Leviticus, but actually to look at the created nature established at the very beginning in Genesis. The author points heavily to the Hebrew phrase ezer kenegado, which is used in Genesis to describe woman. It translates deeply to the corresponding counterpart, the face-to-face strength, the one suitable to him. By establishing this, the author argues that defining a woman's natural use, particularly when reading later passages like Romans 1, as mere sexual availability, breeding equipment, or subordinate utility, fundamentally violates her original created nature. She's established from page 1 as an honored counterpart. The framework insists that any later interpretation reducing her to a sexual object fails this foundational Genesis test immediately.
Building on this deep respect for created life and fruitfulness found in Genesis, the author then draws a really sharp philosophical distinction regarding the modern debate on abortion. According to the source material's interpretation of Genesis, the deliberate destruction of unborn life is an intentional reversal of the natural, life-bearing order. The author points out a specific contrast to address common counterarguments. They argue you cannot use the tragedy of a miscarriage to justify abortion. The framework categorizes miscarriage as an involuntary grief, a death suffered due to a broken world. Abortion, on the other hand, is categorized as an intentional interruption, a death inflicted. Natural death, the author insists, simply does not justify intentional killing within this created order.
This brings us to Section 3, the architecture of boundaries, focusing on Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Now we're getting into the vertebrae of this theological spine. The author points out that Leviticus 18 isn't just a random, disjointed list of ancient rules. It actually maps out an explicit holiness architecture. It systematically categorizes specific boundary types and their corresponding violations. So, you have the family boundary, where the specific violation is incest, the covenant boundary, violated through adultery, The life boundary, violated historically by sacrificing children to Molech, the sex boundary, violated through male-with-male acts, and the species boundary, violated through bestiality. The absolutely crucial argument here is that the text only groups these acts together as abominations after it names these specific explicit boundaries. The specifics build the general category, not the other way around.
Highlighting the careful use of original language, the framework notes that an honest interpretation really has to rely on deep historical context. For example, the text points out that Deuteronomy explicitly addresses the Kadesh, which translates to a cult prostitute. Now, this is historically significant when mapping out the ancient mind. In the ancient Near East, ritual prostitution was incredibly common. The author uses this word to prove that sexual sin and ritual idolatry were intrinsically joined. It wasn't just about private individual acts. Sexual boundary breaking was deeply tied to false worship and pagan temple practices.
Furthermore, the author asserts that this boundary architecture extends to sex embodiment itself. Pointing to Deuteronomy 22:5, the framework addresses a verse that's often mocked today as outdated fabric policing. But actually, the author argues that this prohibition isn't about the specific threads or styles across different cultures. Rather, it's a strict prohibition against the symbolic overthrow of the male and female order. The intentional crossing, masking, or confounding of male and female presentation through clothing is seen as a direct violation of the created distinctions established way back in Genesis. The outward presentation matters, the author argues, because it reflects the inward created reality.
Now for Section 4, Gathered Categories of Immorality in the New Testament.
This brings us to the connective tissue of the New Testament. The author contends that when the New Testament uses the Greek word porneia, which is commonly translated today simply as sexual immorality, it is not a vague modern preference. Remember that foundational rule from earlier? Generalized does not mean undefined. To a first-century audience who is steeped in the Torah, porneia operated as a massive, gathered category. It strictly relies on and fully encompasses all those prior Old Testament boundaries we just discussed: adultery, incest, prostitution, and literally every act God previously categorized as an abomination in Leviticus. That single word carries the entire historical architecture within it.
Yet the New Testament doesn't rely exclusively on broad, gathered terms. The framework presents a really fascinating linguistic deep dive regarding the Apostle Paul's use of explicit terminology. The author points out that Paul actually constructed the Greek word arsenokoitai, which literally translates to male betters. What's brilliant about this, linguistically speaking, is that Paul appears to have mashed together the exact Greek words used in the ancient Septuagint translation of Leviticus 18 to create this specific term. So by using both the broad, gathered category of porneia and highly specific, historically anchored terms like arsenokoitai, the author proves that the broad and the specific work completely in tandem to uphold this theological spine.
You can visually trace this chronological spine, and it tells the story of an unbroken, logical continuity. You've got the starting point in the Torah, where Leviticus explicitly names the specific boundaries. Then, Jesus and the early church in the book of Acts explicitly carry those boundaries forward using the gathered category of porneia to defend the covenant order against surrounding pagan cultures. Finally, Paul utilizes both the broad category and newly forged specific terms to address the early churches in Corinth and Ephesus. The logic, according to the author, never breaks, bends, or reinvents itself as you move from the Old Testament to the New.
Which brings us to Section 5, Revelation and Empire, and the final warning.
That continuous logic takes us all the way to the apocalyptic literature of Revelation, where this framework interprets the ultimate civilizational warnings. The author argues that Revelation shows us sexual disorder isn't merely a private, individual issue, it's heavily tied to civilization and power. The text explicitly warns against the Jezebel pattern. This symbolizes internal church compromise, religious authorities who falsely bless and normalize immorality under the guise of deep spiritual teaching. Then there is the warning of Babylon, representing external compromise. Babylon symbolizes entire empires and economies that profit from bodies, selling abomination as liberation, and joining commerce to immorality. Ultimately, Revelation gathers all these categories together, issuing a final warning to any system that rebels against the created order.
Finally, we reach Section 6, the Gospel of Restoration, which is really the ultimate goal of all this.
Before reaching the final resolution of the author's argument, it's vital to see how this Berean spine acts as a comprehensive critique that cuts in multiple directions, basically challenging almost everyone in modern debates. To the liberal dissenter, the framework insists you simply cannot redefine prior revelation to fit current cultural moods. To the careless conservative, it demands you cannot reduce a woman to mere sexual utility, as that violates the very Genesis creation order you claim to protect. To the abortion defender, it maintains that the tragic reality of natural death never justifies intentional killing, and to the translation manipulator, it demands an honest, historically rooted reliance on original language, regardless of whether those translations make modern readers comfortable.
But you might be wondering, why establish such a rigid, unflinching boundary architecture in the first place? While the author insists that Scripture names these specific sins and builds these strict boundaries not to crush people, but to save them. The old life and its compromises are aggressively confronted so that grace can be built on actual truth rather than pleasant lies. Pointing back to Paul's letters, the author highlights the profound phrase, "Such were some of you." The framework concludes that the ultimate gospel answer to this boundary breaking isn't modern denial, nor is it ancient domination. The ultimate goal is washing, sanctification, justification, and total human restoration back to the original created design.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a question. Does the concept of gathered categories change how you view broad moral terms in our modern debates? The architectural approach of the Berean spine certainly challenges us to look backward at foundational ancient texts when navigating today's intense cultural vocabulary. It demands that we understand the roots of the words we use so freely today. Thank you so much for joining me as we explored this fascinating and challenging framework. Keep asking questions, keep testing the texts, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.